Welcome to Advocating for Dads with Jana Jones.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Advocating for Dads with Jana Jones. I'm Matt Skye. Jana is a dedicated family law attorney with extensive experience in the Charlotte and Mint Hill areas. Her focus on family law, combined with her compassion and client commitment, helps families navigate the complexities of legal matters with care and understanding. Jana, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Matt, for having me. I appreciate that.
So we're going to get into alimony. What are the current alimony or spousal support laws in North Carolina for divorcing couples?
Sure. So the biggest thing is the classification. You have to have a dependent spouse and a supporting spouse, and the court considers a number of factors when they're determining whether they're going to award alimony, how much, and for how long. When it comes to a dependent spouse is someone who is dependent on the supporting spouse's income to maintain their standard of living. Meaning if they don't have income from that supporting spouse, they're essentially destitute. They can't pay their bills. They maybe don't even have a roof over their head. On the other side, a supporting spouse is the spouse who has been the one to financially support the dependent spouse during the course of the marriage. The expectation from the court is that a dependent spouse is probably going to get more money than the supporting spouse wants to pay, but the supporting spouse should not be going into the poorhouse themselves in order to pay it. So the court will consider the need of the spouse that is requesting it, as well as the spouse who's supporting ability to pay.
And what factors go into determining those amounts?
Sure. So the court considers a number of factors. Unlike child support, where there is a worksheet calculation, and essentially we are just plugging in numbers to find out what the North Carolina guidelines tell us about child support, it's a lot more subjective when it comes to alimony. So when it comes to a dependent spouse, the court is going to look at the standard of living that dependent spouse has become accustomed to. They're also going to look at the age of the dependent spouse and the supporting spouse, the finances and how the parties have handled finances during the course of their marriage, the earning capacities of the parties, and any number of factors that might be relevant to determining whether or not alimony should be awarded and for how much and how long.
And in what cases would alimony just not be awarded at all?
Sure. So the court doesn't have a hard fixed rule, but usually we say 10 years of marriage or so is where the court's going to really start considering alimony. A short marriage, a year or two, you're going to have a harder time getting any type of permanent alimony. Maybe some post-separation support, which is essentially like light temporary or light alimony, temporary alimony, I should say. But to get a hard fixed alimony award for a significant period of time or a large chunk of money, you're usually going to have to be married for a decent amount of time for the court to feel like that's actually equitable.
Now, I thought I've heard this before and I might be mistaken. Is there a type of implied marriage after a certain amount of time where alimony can be awarded even if there was never an official marriage?
Not in the state of North Carolina. There is not. You've got to actually be married. So parties could cohabitate for decades. And then that party who has been supporting the dependent party decides to up and leave. Unfortunately, the party who is dependent on the income has no recourse in family court because they're not married. You have to be married in North Carolina.
So on my own misconception, can you tell us any more misconceptions people might have about spousal support in North Carolina?
Well, I think a common misconception is that it has to be a periodic monthly payment. Sometimes alimony can be a lump sum. So maybe we decide we're going to do $1,000 a month in general over the course of a year or so, right? So that's $12,000. Maybe to strike a deal, instead of having to pay that $12,000 over time, we offer $10,000 in 30 days. That supporting spouse, dependent spouse might appreciate getting more cash at hand at a quicker amount of time than having to wait each month to get $1,000. So you can have lump sum payments when it comes to alimony. And I think a lot of times people just assume it has to be a monthly payment.
So who ends up actually paying alimony or spousal support when couples are divorcing in North Carolina? And what are some of those factors? I know we touched on this a bit. Yeah,
so again, the person has to be a supporting spouse. The court has to find that they are a supporting spouse and not just that they made more money than the other party. You know, if parties make different amounts of money, but they still split the bills, then that person making more money isn't necessarily providing a lifestyle for the quote unquote dependent spouse. So the court's going to consider how the parties have handled their finances, not just the actual earnings of each of the parties.
And how do shared assets prior factor in?
So when it comes to assets, that's getting into the realm of equitable distribution. Alimony is specifically talking about cash award to a dependent spouse based on their need and the supporting party's ability to pay.
And let's say, as we always see with appeals processes and what have you, if there's a disagreement on an amount, what happens after that?
So if the hearing is in front of a judge, their decision is final. You can't appeal it, but outside of an actual appeals process, that will be the final decision. If the parties are mediating, like we mentioned in a previous podcast, then until whatever is mediated actually gets put into writing, either as a separation agreement that is signed and notarized by both of the parties or as a consent order, then it's not ideal. But until it's in writing, it's not in writing, right? So until that happens, the parties could renegotiate those terms.
So does alimony almost always go to trial, or is that something that can be mediated?
No, oftentimes it is mediated. North Carolina requires equitable distribution claims to be mediated before you can go in front of the judge. And oftentimes, if there are other issues that the parties have, like alimony, custody, or child support, we end up talking about all of the issues in mediation, because why not, right? We have to do it anyway. So let's see if we can get all issues settled and get some type of global settlement.
And during those cases, you mentioned sometimes there can be a lump sum, sometimes there's monthly payments. What's that sort of separation you see in your practice? How much of the time is it monthly? How much of the time is it a lump sum?
I think it really depends on the finances of the parties, particularly the supporting spouse. If they have a nest egg somewhere and they're like, you know what, I was going to have to pay, say, $100K over from the ED side. I'm going to pay $200K to take care of the equitable distribution and the alimony claim. Then that's generally the better way to deal with it, because, once you're done paying it, it's over. You can move on with your life, and financially, you don't have to deal with that dependent spouse anymore.
Yeah, I imagine for a lot of couples, the closure is something that there's a lot of emotions involved, right? That closure is probably something that they're shooting for when possible.
Definitely.
How is alimony or spousal support paid while a divorce is in process?
So if the parties have an agreement on their own before they get attorneys and the courts involved, then they're paying however they've been paying, right? Absent that, there is an opportunity for the party who is requesting alimony to request a temporary hearing. It's called a post-separation support hearing. So at that hearing, the judge will hear the arguments of both parties and their evidence, and they will fill out things called financial affidavits and exchange documentation prior to the hearing. And at that hearing, the judge will make a determination about what post-separation support or alimony is going to be awarded in a temporary basis.
And can alimony or spousal support ever be changed? And I guess what would cause those changes?
Sure. So any order can be changed if a motion to modify is filed and it meets the requisite requirements in order for the court to be able to modify the order. Generally, you're looking at a substantial change in circumstances with any modifications related to money. So if somebody lost their job, somebody, hit the lottery, there's just not the need, or the ability to pay is no longer there. Those are going to be the most common reasons why a case might be modified. There are instances, though, where alimony is non-modifiable. And if that's the situation, then it cannot be changed.
So what parameters would make a case non-modifiable?
Generally, if the judge orders it that way or the parties agree to that through some sort of consent order or separation agreement.
And have you ever seen a lottery case?
I actually have not. That would definitely be an interesting one.
So, so it can't be changed, or sometimes can be changed, but oftentimes cannot. Does alimony or spousal support last forever in North Carolina? And what factors might terminate that alimony?
So generally death, remarriage, sometimes cohabitation, the party needing the income or the party giving the income would affect it. And I wouldn't say it lasts forever. Again, there's no hard rule because it's all about subjective factors that the court is considering. And when we're negotiating outside of court, we're arguing over those different factors. But typically what I tend to see is that alimony will last, if it's going to be a periodic payment, roughly half the length of the marriage. So if you're talking about a 20-year marriage, you're probably talking about 10 years or so of alimony.
I think for many of us, the legal system is so murky. How much of the cases you deal with are objective results in terms of purely based on data and evidence, and how much of it has a subjectivity to it, how a case is made, context, et cetera?
Sure. So for instance, I mentioned that there's financial affidavits that the parties have to fill out for a post-separation support hearing. So there are questions on that affidavit that ask things like haircuts, lunches for children, if there are any children involved, versus lunches for the party that, goes to work, party asking for the alimony, the payment for the home, whether it's a mortgage, rent, gasoline, car notes, credit card debt. It really drills into the details that are the financial details of each of the parties. And sometimes those numbers may or may not be believable, right? So if somebody is claiming $10,000 a month on food, that's going to look a little suspect, and it's unlikely the judge is going to agree that somebody's spending that much money on food. It can be subjective because you're estimating. Obviously, from month to month, those numbers are going to change. And so we're trying to get to a number that's realistic. And when a judge is going through those financial affidavits and hearing the evidence put on as to those different factors, they may or may not be agreeing with those numbers, and they may be slashing some of those numbers. They may think somebody underestimated and they're going to add, and maybe they were too conservative with their number, they're going to add to it. You know, I've had clients, because we always start with the client filling it out. So obviously I don't know their finances. And then we generally go through it together after. And I'm like, are you sure you only spend $10 a month on haircuts? That doesn't sound right. You know, and so then we have to drill into those details and make sure that we have an accurate picture of their financial situation. And that is going to help determine whether or not alimony is reasonable, right? Because there may be a need. Maybe the dependent spouse truly does need income to maintain their standard of living. But if the supporting spouse has a ton of debt and has been carrying all this debt along with all the bills of the home, and now the parties are separating and they've got to find a place to live, the other party has to find a place to live, maybe they can't afford 2 mortgage payments or 2 rental payments. And so the court really is going to be considering both parties' finances when they're determining how much it's going to be awarded, and frankly, if it's going to be awarded.
That's interesting what you mentioned in terms of people potentially fudging the numbers. How do you confirm that all the numbers are correct when you actually move forward with the process?
So I'd say the most common way to try to figure out if these numbers make sense is looking at bank statements, right? If it's cash, we have no idea. But if there is a bank statement, if there is a credit card statement that is in line with the general number that they're putting out there, then that number is probably right. If we look at bank statements or credit card statements from a few months back and those numbers are not equaling what they put on that financial affidavit, then we've got something to question.
Can you also detail for us some of the differences when it comes to alimony when there's children involved versus no children?
So in North Carolina, alimony and child support are 2 separate issues. Oftentimes, particularly in Mecklenburg County, we will have a hearing that deals with both issues, and the court will hear all the financial arguments from both parties to determine it. But those are going to be 2 separate orders, technically. One amount is going to be for child support, and that is going to be based on the North Carolina guidelines. Unless the parties are high earning, meaning that they combined, as of the date of this recording, combined make more than $40,000 a month combined. If they do, then they're off the guidelines, and the court will consider other factors when they're determining the child support amount. When it comes to that post-separation support, though, again, that's subjective and it's contingent on the number of factors that are at play. And so there's a lot more subjectivity with the post-separation support. Additionally, the court is going to consider that now perhaps this person also has a child support obligation. So that's an additional bill that they didn't have before. And so that has to be taken into account. You know, you can't get blood out of a turnip. So there's only so much money that payer spouse, that supporting spouse may have. And so if 3/4 of it or more ends up being the child support obligation because of how the guidelines play out, it just doesn't leave a lot there for a post-separation support award.
So what if one of the partners fails to pay alimony or spousal support? Can that be enforced in North Carolina?
Absolutely. So just like any other order of the court, it's enforceable by the contempt powers of the court. And so the party that is aggrieved would be filing a motion for contempt, alleging which provisions in the order have been violated, and asking the court hold that person in contempt for failure to follow the court's order.
And is there ever a case where someone should try to handle alimony on their own?
Not unless you guys really get along. You know, if you throw out a number to your spouse and they say, okay, that works, and you guys do that, then great. Don't get anybody involved. Save your money. Unfortunately, that's not usually the case, right? Somebody wants more than the other party is willing to pay, or somebody isn't willing to pay anything at all. And so generally those cases do end up getting litigated, or best case scenario, mediated.
Do you see those cases where at some point there was an internal agreement and eventually it kind of broke down?
Absolutely. Yeah. Oftentimes parties don't know what they're entitled to or what's realistic to ask for or what's realistic to have to pay. until they go get legal advice. So when they are working just off of their own knowledge and whatever they agree to, that might be one number, right? But then if somebody goes and gets a consult with an attorney, explains their situation, learns that maybe they're entitled to more or maybe they're overpaying, and that can be a situation that causes the parties a little bit of acrimony. And now we're going to have to get into some litigation.
So what sets your firm apart in getting the best results for your client when it comes to alimony or spousal support?
I think that knowledge is power, kind of going through those factors, weighing pros and cons. If I'm representing the party who is trying to get the alimony, then we're going through trying to figure out what's the need and how do we justify this need to the court or to a mediator if we're trying to do a mediation process. If I am representing the spouse who is going to be paying the alimony, then I'm looking to see how much can you actually afford to pay versus what you're going to need to, start your life in a new direction. And we don't want you going into the poorhouse trying to pay alimony. So those are the things that I'm really drilling those details down with my client so that we know where we stand.
Jana, we've covered a lot of ground today. If you had one major takeaway for our viewers and listeners, what would that be?
Always consult with an attorney. Whether you are the spouse that is going to be paying the alimony or you're the spouse that is hoping to receive the alimony, get a consultation with an attorney so that you actually understand the factors involved and how they apply to your particular situation.
It's a great point to wrap up on. Everybody, thanks so much for tuning in to Advocating for Dads with Jana Jones. For more information or to schedule a consultation, visit lawofficeofjkj.com. Jana, thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Matt. I appreciate it.
Thanks for watching. If you like this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more amazing videos like this one.